topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I'm an organizational psychologist, workforce advisor, management consultant, speaker, and author. And my team and I at Gusto Now help equip your organization to best attract, engage, and keep today's diverse and discerning workforce. We do so in part by teaching you how to activate meaning and purpose and inspiration throughout your leadership and culture. And did you know that inspiration is good for the bottom line? In fact, inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, alisecortez.com. Before we get into today's program, I am thrilled to announce that registration is ongoing for the fabulous new conference for women, for which I'll serve as the MC. It's called Thrive in 25, and it's a jam-packed few days in Chicago, June 25th through the 28th, 2025. It's designed to develop women as whole selves, from bolstering your mindset to your financial acumen, to leadership, to incorporating nature and art into your life to raise consciousness, and much more. Visit thriveit25.com for more information, and to register, use my promo code GUSTO in all caps to gain access to the free books and programs I'll be gifting registrants. See you there. Now, getting back into today's program, we have with us for the second time around, we have Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson, a philosopher with 25 years of experience advising business leaders pursuing meaning and providing work with purpose. He is the Barbara and David A. Koch Coach Endowed Chair in Business Ethics and Academic Director of the Melrose and the Toro Company Center for Principal Leadership at the University of St. Thomas, and on the Business and Society faculty of NYU's Stern School of Business. Also with us, back again a second time, is Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, who is the Camellia Latino Spinell Endowed Term Chair and Professor of Management at Babson College. She teaches, researches, and coaches others about what it means to craft a meaningful career and appreciate the risks and rewards of work as a calling. Today, they have written The Meaning and Purpose of Work, an interdisciplinary framework for considering what work is for, which we'll be talking about today. Christopher joins us from Minneapolis and Jennifer from Boston. Christopher and Jen, welcome back to Working on Purpose.
It's great to be back. Thank you, Alise.
Welcome.
Thank you, Alise. This is wonderful.
So welcome. And look at this beautiful thing you brought forth. It's just beautiful. You know, it's not a lot of pages, but there is a lot in here, which I really appreciate. So you packed in a lot of really interesting, juicy, yummy information. So we're going to dive into it. I'd venture to say that most of the people that are listening to this podcast today probably don't know just how much variance and nuance there is to the world of meaning and purpose. So we're going to dive in. Okay, so let's do this. I would love to open with your perspectives, one of you or both of you. Why people do you think are so fixated today on meaning and purpose? What's the draw? And do you think it does differ by generations? I think it does, but what's your perspective?
I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead, Christopher.
Go ahead, Jen.
I was going to say, I'll jump in briefly and then let Christopher take it. As you can see, we're both eager to answer. I do want to give a shout out, Alise, as you held up that beautiful book. And I do think it's more beautiful perhaps than like the average book. The cover art was done by Christopher's wife, Beth, who is a painter. Loved that it reminds us of the sea and the sky and just this contemplative, color and vision. And so that's what we hoped to bring forward. So to answer your question, I think that meaning and purpose are hopefully always on our minds to some extent, but never more so than when we're faced with a crisis. And so I think especially now, post-pandemic, people are still grappling with the pandemic feels sort of near but far. And we have a lot of remnants and vestiges of it. And I think one of those is people still wondering, if the work that they do, which pulls them away from anything else they might do with their life, maybe pulls them away from loved ones or requires sacrifices of various kinds, really is how they want to be spending their time. And so I think we all get a little more contemplative, a little more intentional when faced with crisis. And I just think we still feel those traces of the sort of formative impact that the pandemic had on us. To your question about generations, I think no one feels this more acutely than today's youngest generation in the workforce, Generation Z, who really, came of age, sort of entered the workforce, grappled directly with what the pandemic meant. And so research is showing Generation Z compared to prior generations values things like having a stable job, having financial security. It's sort of like they saw how tumultuous things could be and how unpredictable, and they're seeking a bedrock. And I think part of that, because the millennials were described, their one generation, older generation was described as the purpose generation. But I think that what we're seeing is the same holds true for Generation Z. They value like a third of Generation Z says their number one criterion for work is that they feel that it makes a difference in the world, that it has a clear meaning and a clear purpose. So I just think that's part of that post-COVID nature, that it kind of forces us to ask the big questions.
Completely
As Jen
agree.
alludes to, there are people who study generations for a living. And so there are people who know far more about the characteristics of Generation Z versus millennials than I do. And I think that I'm out of the generational forecasting business because it's so complex, these forces that influence their choices. But I can say something about some members of Generation Z who I happen to be meeting with an hour from now in class. And these are students who are actually mostly seniors in college who are doing internships. And it's April 15th, tax day. And most of my students in this class are actually doing internships with tax accounting firms. They're sort of arms and legs for the piles and piles of tax returns that they have to get through. And I have to say that at the beginning of the semester, when my students were new in their internships, they were expressing great satisfaction from learning a new technique or a new statute and just getting from the beginning to the end of a tax form. But now that that's old hat, they're wanting more. A lot of them are saying, this was great, I learned a lot, but I wonder if a lifetime of doing tax returns is enough for me. So in that sense, I think the questions of meaning and purpose can be timeless.
Really appreciate you saying that, Christopher. Also in your book, this came up. I noticed you said something about people saying, I want more. And what I've discovered as well in my work and when I'm out speaking is that what they really oftentimes mean by that is they do want more meaning. And that more is very interesting sort of a tell. It's a very simple tell. So this idea of work, right? Especially you've been talking about the idea of his tax returns and, oh my gosh, I got mine done on Sunday. But work can be, at its best, wildly fulfilling and a chance to really do meaningful work. And at its worst, it can be soul sucking. So let's talk a little bit about what it looks like when it's at its best.
I have an example of when it's at its worst, but hopefully we can transition to when it's at its best.
Okay, that's cool.
For tonight's class, my students read the opening of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which famously depicts a pin-making factory in which it takes 18 manual steps to create a fully fashioned straight pin. So just imagine 18 steps to make this simple little item, and how dull each one of those steps must be. So one thing that we're going to be talking about is, well, why do we break those tasks into simpler and simpler tasks such that there are 18 of them? And one of the reasons is that it's incredibly productive to do so. It's far more efficient to work in organizations than to work on our own. And so in that sense, what makes work at its best meaningful is the ability to do much more than we can individually, to, as the saying goes, to be part of something much bigger than ourselves. And yet that example shows the risk that work can also kind of destine us for doing something much smaller than ourselves. So it's really up to the people who have the power to assign and divide and distribute work to think about how it is assigned and designed and distributed to make it more fulfilling.
I like what you said in the book about how work can give meaning and purpose, and it can take it away. I think that's a really powerful way to think about it. Did you want to add anything to that, Jen?
Well, it's funny. Christopher keeps referencing his class. And so I just came from class. He's going to class and I just came from class. One of the things we talked about in this class in particular was the concept of flow. So this state where you are so fully engaged in your mind and body that, for example, you lose track of time. And just as Christopher is talking about these sort of double-edged sword, the students have a lot of trouble disentangling true flow from I had a boring job and I zoned out to get through it. They're like, is that flow? Because I basically go somewhere else in my mind to get through the day. And we had to explain how that's like the opposite of flow. I think the only other thing so I think a flow state could be a work at its best kind of state. And then the opposite of that, sort of, I have to numb myself to get through the workday is work at its worst. But I think the other piece that matters a lot is about recognition and appreciation. And so I think often we have important work in society that we know is important, but that too often gets looked down upon or goes unnoticed. And so I think that's the other side of it, is that few of us are lucky enough to work in both, occupations that we feel sufficient autonomy. We love it. We're engaged. Maybe we do occasionally or often reach a state of flow, and that are also recognized and appreciated within society.
Well, that is certainly what I'm out to do, as you both know, is out to create more workplaces where people can really feel that sense of being fulfilled, and that this is where I want to be. This is where I belong, and I don't want to leave, what I call destination workplaces. So I'm certainly out to help champion more of those experiences, because I want people to be able to define work, as we want to talk about next, in a way that really matters to them. So let's talk a little bit about definitions of work. And I like how you talk about how when people do start talking about definitions of work for themselves, that it really reveals what they value. So if you could situate for us what work really means.
Yeah. We define work as that which is effortful, purposeful, and recognized by society. And here I don't mean recognized by society like what I was just talking about in terms of really valuing and recognizing and appreciating the work sort of in its own right. So not, walking by the street sweeper or the office cleaner without, thanking and acknowledging their work, which is more what I was alluding to in the first answer. But I mean, at a very basic level, like we would say, we consider it work in society. We consider it to be work. Now, often that overlaps with paid employment. So a question might be what gets left out of this definition, and what gets left out are things that are purposeful and effortful, but which we generally do not consider to be work in the colloquial sense that we use it in everyday language. So things like if we clean our own homes or raise our own children, those are a heck of a lot of work, extremely purposeful. And yet when we pay someone else to do it, it's work. When we do it for ourselves, it's not. Of course, it excludes, historically marginalized work like that, which was done by women or minorities, like housework and childcare. But we're sort of meeting a contemporary definition, sort of where it's at, that generally dovetails with paid employment.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I thought was interesting when you talked about the notion of how, how someone describes their work is going to speak to what they value. that I went straight to as a logotherapist. Logos is Greek for meaning. So that's one of my degrees and one of my practicums that I use in my consulting. What we know through logotherapy, the lens of logotherapy and logophilosophy, is that meaning is registered along our values. So what you find meaningful, Jen, will be different from what I find meaningful and what's different for Christopher, because we have different values. And I certainly saw that in my own research, and I see it when I'm out speaking. And even when I told you I spoke with Professor Thaddeus Metz, it's very, very clear to me that one of his chief values is cognitive contribution. So what he finds meaningful and valuable is very much his research and all of his articles and books that he's written, because he values cognitive contribution. So just kind of interesting to me how that really called out, and I could see how I could dance and play with your research as well through my lens.
A true philosopher, of course, a philosopher appreciates cognitive contribution.
Right, absolutely.
I'm also thinking, as I listen to the two of you, that the way in which we express the word work kind of betrays our values. So I was giving a talk recently, and somebody came up to me before I was beginning to speak, and he said, work is a 4-letter word, which is, I think, a very old joke, but it was new to me. And I thought, well, he's just demonstrated his work values. Whereas I grew up in a home with a mother whose very identity was her work, and she kind of inherited that from her father. And so work was very much not a 4-letter word in the way that I came to value it.
Mm-hmm. Same is true for me. Very, very, very similar kind of background in that way. Let us grab our first break and let our listeners and viewers chew on what we've been talking about so far. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson, a philosopher with 25 years of experience advising business leaders, pursuing meaning and providing work for a purpose, and Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, who teaches, researches, and coaches others about what it means to craft a meaningful career and appreciate the risks and rewards of work as a calling. We've been talking about the good and the bad, the pros and cons of work and what it can mean for us. After the break, we're going to start with how we distinguish meaning from purpose. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, as I too am dedicated to help create a world where organizations thrive because of their people thrive, and they're led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness. And we do business that betters the world. I keep researching and writing my own books. So one of my latest that came out is called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help leaders understand the needs and wants of today's evolved workforce, and then provide 22 best practices to help you fold that into your culture to provide that for them. You can find my books on Amazon or my personal site, alisecortez.com. If you are just joining us, my guests are Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson and Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, the authors of The Meaning and Purpose at Work, an interdisciplinary framework for considering what work is for, which is what we've been talking about here so far. So I think what I've noticed a lot of times when I'm out speaking is people tend to conflate the words meaning and purpose. And from my vantage point, they are wildly and radically different. How would you distinguish the two?
I've had a lifetime of research to think about this, plus the break we just had, and I still don't know exactly how to answer this question. So I'm actually really curious about the clarity of the distinction that you have, Alise, because I'm not incredibly clear about it. I will say that we say in the book that purpose is inherently teleological, which means that it is goal-oriented. There's a destination in mind, whereas meaning can be sort of experienced in the moment without necessarily having a purpose. And I think there's some truth to that in the way that we sometimes use the words meaning and purpose. But as you alluded to, some people conflate the definitions and some people have the definitions completely reversed. I'll just say one more thing, which is that Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, refers to the experience of appreciating an aesthetic object as, he said this in German, but it's often translated in English as purposiveness without purpose. And I love that phrase, even though I think there's a lot of disagreement about what it actually means. But to me, that suggests that you can sort of discover in that moment of aesthetic appreciation a reason for being, like an art object can be an end in itself. And yet it doesn't have purpose because you don't have to do anything with it. It doesn't have to be useful in any way. So I think that's probably closer to what I just described as meaning, because purpose does have an end in mind. But those are just some of the things that I think about as a philosopher in trying to distinguish these concepts.
Mm-hmm. Jen, anything you want to add before I weigh in with my perspective?
I guess just the way I feel like I'm here to say the way we tend to use these words in the, typical both consulting and research is when we talk about, we rarely talk about meaning at the organizational level, but we do talk about purpose at the organizational level, which I think is interesting. And then I do wonder about the ending in sight that Christopher just mentioned, and whether that's, is that intentional, or should we read too much into it that it's purpose that got adopted at the organizational level and not meaning? But I think that is potentially just another distinction, whether it's merely a way we use the language or if there's some deeper meaning to it. We do tend to talk about organizations with a purpose in a way that we don't talk about organizations with meaning.
I think that's all of this is incredibly astute. What I would add to layer in to this whole conversation is, from my vantage point, and what I talk about is really meaning is our energy supply, and we can find meaning in the moment. Meaning, and this is a meaningful conversation. So, of course, unlike Professor Metz that we talked about before, who talks about meaning in work and meaning in life, I'm focused in meaning of work and meaning in work. So for me, meaning is always that's that energizing source for us. It's the thing that allows us to be moved by our work in some way. And then purpose, of course, really is that why. Why are we why are we here? Do we exist as an organization? Why do we exist as an individual human? And so that really speaks to it's a directional sort of orientation that can guide one's choices and values and decisions. And this is where I think it gets interesting, is it's, from my view, it's also connected to our potential. And that is why I believe people are so convicted by it, because they know on some level, this has something to do with my potential. And I believe it does. When you really fall into it on a deep level, I believe you can reach and realize more of your potential.
I actually think that there was a lot in what you said that was very clear, that was aligned with what I said, which was very unclear. And I think that's probably a good thing. I think one thing that scholars might talk about is, do we need common definitions of these words? Do we need to understand a common distinction? I certainly think it makes it easier for us to talk about these things. But in some way, there is meaning, so to speak, in just talking about the distinctions.
Completely agree. I could talk about this all day long. You guys don't need to go to class afterwards, or you're good. We're just going to keep going. Okay. Well, along those lines, I have to say, and I'm jealous. I think it was you, Jen, that studied under Professor Amy. I want to say her name is Reznuski. Is that the right way?
Rezneski. You're very close.
Okay, Rezneski. I've known of her work for a long time. I know I've cited it many, many times. And so I want to talk about what she came up with. She and others, I believe, came up with. She has a few co-authors, looking at work as jobs, careers, and calling. And this is really important too, not just for your own individual self, but you in relation to your partner. That was really, really interesting. I can tell you probably part of the reasons that I'm divorced is because I have a calling orientation and my ex-husband has a career orientation. I can almost guarantee you that's part of it. So let's get into it.
Yeah.
career calling.
Awesome. All right. So I was unbelievably lucky, understatement, to study at the Stern School of Business when Amy Wrzesniewski was there as a professor. She ended up being my dissertation chair. From there, she moved to Yale School of Management, and she's now at Wharton. So, her long, illustrious academic career continues, and I merely try to just, ride on her coattails, basically. But so she popularized this idea of job, career, and calling for specifically sort of vocational psychology, organizational psychology, and organizational behavior within the management discipline. But this was an idea of job, career, calling that originated actually in sociology. So Robert Bella and colleagues wrote this book, Habits of the Heart, which was all about actually engagement in civic life. And as we discuss in the book, our relationship to our work, where, we spend kind of the majority of our waking hours, most of us do, was given 5 pages in the book, was dedicated to work. And in those 5 pages, they came up with job, career, and calling. And it was all based on interviews with people to understand their engagement with civic society or lack thereof. And again, work was not explored in depth, but there was this nugget of wisdom in there that then Amy had the, corresponding wisdom to really run with and translate, and then subsequently relate to all these various organizational and individual outcomes, which has been really her, the legacy of her own research. And so just for readers and listeners who may be unfamiliar with these terms, a job is when the work is a means to an end, typically a financial end. And the most common, job orientation is mostly about making money from the work. A career orientation is more about, again, a means to an end, but this time it's advancement within one's career. Traditionally, that looked like ascension within an organizational hierarchy. But today, and I just told this to my students actually today, it might look like, respect within your peer group, however that's defined, centrality within an occupational community. I mean, I don't want to say out loud to them, number of subscribers or, anything like that, but you just figure whatever is your metric of success, and that's achievement orientation, that's a career orientation. Mm-hmm. And then finally, a calling is where the work is a meaningful end unto itself, and often, but not always, affiliated with the idea that your work makes the world a better place or does a societal good. And so, again, a calling, we glorify it. We tend to advise people, find your calling, find your purpose, find your calling. And so we know an awful lot about the calling orientation now, and a lot of research, including my own, has sort of run with that orientation. I did want to briefly touch on Amy's work with Winnie Zhang. That's all about this congruence of work orientations in couples. I agree. I think it's completely fascinating. And the overall finding that when our work orientations are incongruent with, a spouse or life partner, that this is generally bad. So for example, if one partner were to become unemployed, it takes them longer to find a job if their partner is not congruent with their work orientation. And this really actually then links back to research Christopher and I have done about how our work orientations are perceived by those around us, those who are close relations, whether, spouses, siblings, parents, children, coworkers, etc., but that we sort of, to know someone and to know about their life largely is to also know something about their work. And this idea of Christopher and I look more at sort of how do others view the work, how would my spouse view my work, which is a little different than saying, are our own work orientations congruent or incongruent? But I think there's just something so fascinating about, and I think this is where research on job career calling is going. We're looking more at these sort of relational complexities and dynamics and sort of the interplay of, it used to be just what is my own orientation, not even thinking about other people. Mm-hmm. And I even have a paper, it's not yet published, but we're working on, that's all about work orientations in teams. I mean, you can think of superior subordinate congruence. I mean, there's just lots of places that this can go, which I think is really exciting.
I completely agree. Did you want to chime into something, Christopher, on that?
I'm just thinking back to the research that brought Jen and I together as colleagues, actually. And I'm going to give another shout out to Amy Wrzesniewski because she's the reason that we met at a conference that Amy organizes. But our initial research together was on 9/11 victims. And
Love
of
it.
course, the writing about these victims' lives and working lives was based on interviews with their loved ones, who often didn't really understand the work from the inside. They weren't coworkers, they were family members. So if you think about how much do you actually see the work that your significant other does, maybe a little bit more today when we work remotely, but rarely do we get to see the office from the inside. And so we did find in our research probably a disproportionate level of attributions of work as a calling, in a sense, because we hypothesized that the close relations of the victims of the attack, in a sense, romanticized the work of their loved ones. They wanted to remember them as having worked at something that they loved doing with people that they loved doing it with.
And I really appreciate that. I can completely see how that would be. I love the work that you've done, by the way. I'm such a fan of that. When it comes to looking at these different ways that people relate to their work, I think I might have mentioned to you that my research for my dissertation and then my postdoc research was on meaning in work and identity. I wanted to understand how people experienced meaning in their work and how it related to their sense of self. And so I found 5 modes when I did my dissertation. But then when I layered in the depth, the kind of meaning along Maslow's hierarchy, and I looked at, so that was the meaning levels, then also the affect, whether it's positive or negative. What I found were 15 modes of engagement, and they were anywhere from the most engaged was transcendent connection, when people felt like they were doing work where they were helping to elevate or connect people to a higher source or God or whatever. And then next, living your purpose, which is the one that I experienced today. And at the very, very end, the most negative is existential crisis. So I thought it was interesting that Amy's work does sort of align with some of that. I could probably plunk several of my modes in there, but when you add the negative balance in there, it becomes something else. It's really kind of interesting. So anyway, amazing stuff. We can talk more about that some other time, but that's my research. I do want to cut to a break, but unless if you want to say anything before we go on our break.
Just that I found, I mean, what I have read about your research, I think is fascinating. And I do really like that hierarchy. So Christopher and my 9/11 research sort of challenged. We often talk about job, career, calling, and that's like in order of hierarchy or in order of importance. And the 9/11 research sort of challenges that and says even a job could be valuable if it provides for one's family or a means to a valuable end. But I think your typology is much more, that hierarchy really is built in a much more intuitive way. So it's just something I appreciate about it.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. I loved it. Obviously, it's truly a passion of mine. Okay, let's grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson, a philosopher with 25 years of experience advising business leaders, pursuing meaning and providing work for a purpose, and Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, who teaches researchers and coaches others about what it means to craft a meaningful career and appreciate the risks and rewards of work as a calling. We've been talking about the differences between meaning and purpose and really getting into the nitty-gritty of of meaning. After the break, we want to talk about the pros and the cons of pursuing a calling. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. I mentioned in the last break that one of my books came out recently. It's called The Great Revitalization. What I did for you is I created a very simple 3-page assessment. It's free that you can pull off my Gusto-Now site, and it will help you understand the extent to which today your culture is meeting the discerning needs of today's workforce. If you are just joining us, my guests are Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson and Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, the authors of The Meaning and Purpose of Work, an interdisciplinary framework for considering what work is for. So I think people will be really interested to hear some of the notions of both. I think most people probably think that there's only pros to pursuing a calling. And I think it's valuable that you have distinguished that there are some very, very strong cons. Which do you want to talk about first?
Yeah, well, let me start with the reason that everybody thinks that callings are so positive, and boy, do they. And that's in part because we have this very strong cultural message: find your calling, love your life, do what you love, the money will follow. Steve Jobs telling people, the only way to do good work is to do what you love, back in a, turn of the millennium commencement speech at Stanford. And so people just sort of, and it makes an intuitive sense. There's all these studies coming out now that I think are fascinating about people in positions of power within organizations and their sort of lay theories, if you will, about the calling-oriented employees being the good employees and wanting to evaluate them better, promote them faster, pay them more. So again, this is a cultural message that's out there and that really does have, I think, some legs within organizations. And of course, let me also say, by way of framing, that certainly an alternative to meaningful work, meaning less work or drudgery or work that feels like there's no point, no recognition, it makes the world a worse place, all these things that are sort of, if we were to say the theoretical opposite of work as a calling, we don't want that either. So I'm not here to say, no, calling's bad and we should all embrace like meaningless work. The way I want more to phrase it is that a calling can be an extreme orientation toward work. That extreme can come with extreme pros, but we are having a one-sided conversation if we don't talk about the extreme cons. And it's kind of similar to how people talk about things like, basically any cognition, any personality trait, any attitude, you can sort of have this one side of it and then another side of it, right? So I'm, a hard worker, but then do I sometimes work too hard and I don't know when to, put the work away. And it's like that with work as a calling. So, I and others have done studies that have really linked a calling at work to feeling overall that life is both sort of better, you're living a better life and a more purposeful life. And in some ways, maybe we could say, if that's the end goal, that's all we need to know. But there are other, I think, more like hidden and insidious ways potentially that work as a calling can, to some extent, maybe erode an otherwise good quality of life. So one of those would be through workplace relationships. So we talked earlier about, congruence with the spouse and all that kind of things. But just as a calling can make us have very high standards for our work, and maybe we put in more effort and perform better, which the research backs up, we can sometimes be selective in when and how we do that, and judgmental of others and even of our organizations. So the calling, because it's so meaningful, because it's so deeply held, because it's so important to me and central in my life, and I might even see it, people have described it as a moral duty, what it means to do less than 100% or to see anyone else in the organization doing less than, let's say, 150%. I don't like that. If I have a very strong calling, I might judge that. I might have unhealthy workplace relationships, strained relationships with, people at the same level and different levels as me. And that might come out in ways that are like not that adaptive for the organization. The other then is that personal cost to myself. Do I know how? The positive side is to say, the calling-oriented employees, they will always go above and beyond, which the research backs up. They will. But they'll do so even at a cost to themselves. So it could be a literal cost, like I'm more likely to be the one to show up and do the extra work for no additional pay, nights, weekends, whenever you need me. at what point does that either strain relations at home or create a, sort of unsustainable, even maybe exploitative situation at an extreme? And at what point am I not looking out for my own health and well-being? So research backs up that employees with stronger callings have trouble detaching from work at the end of the workday. They are thinking about work, sometimes ruminating about work, even at night, waking up with less energy. Physical and mental health can decline. So again, this seems a little bit at odds. On one hand, we're saying calling can be so beneficial for all these same factors. And it's really sort of that tipping point where can you draw the healthy boundary? And at what point does deep engagement go into potential for burnout? And I just think that's part of our cultural conversation now too, is a conversation about drawing boundaries and burnout. And again, COVID led us all to think, okay, I'm working from home now, but working more than ever. So I just, I want to sort of caution people as much as we want our work, to not be meaningless and to have meaning, there can be some unexpected things that come with us just to be on guard for.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I love about this conversation is that I'm learning and discovering as we have it. Jen and I have talked about these phenomena a million times, and of course, we've written about them together, but I've never heard Jen express calling in such an Aristotelian way, to use a big word. So Aristotle famously had this table of virtues and vices, and the virtues were always in the mean between the extremes. So for example, courage is a virtue, but too much courage is rashness, and not enough courage is cowardliness. And I was just thinking, if work as a calling is a virtue, what's the extreme where there's too much of it? And that is Victor Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's character of, this guy who creates life from lifeless parts in order to make this scientific breakthrough. And in the course of doing so, ruins his relationships, ruins his community, ruins the life of the being that he's created. And then if I'm thinking about what is a deficiency of work as a calling, another literary character I think of is Melville's Bartleby, who just stops doing his work altogether and says, I would prefer not to when asked to do that work, and dies sad and alone. So I think this idea of calling as a healthy balance is probably where we ought to be, instead of encouraging such an excess of it.
And that's our next book, folks.
Okay. Well, we got to come back. Remember that this is, you got to break the record of 4. So what's interesting, just layering in one more bit for me when it comes to the world of calling, is from my own experience, is that there's so much fulfillment in it, and the idea, and that which is so, it's like an elixir, it's a drug. And of course, getting the feedback, this is what I needed kind of thing. And it does feel like it's such a social good. It's a good beyond myself. So that is probably part of, what keeps me going so strongly, is I keep getting, more and more of that wonderful drug of fulfillment, and it just keeps the train going. So we haven't really talked about that part of it, but that's a big part of it as well, I would say.
I think calling it a drug is really insightful, because there is a sense in which a calling can be addictive.
Oh, very much so. No question. Yeah,
I think that the addictive married with the morality, the perceived morality of a calling, gets us into lots of fascinating territory for sort of callings going, too much, too little, judgments. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, and this kind of gets us into where I want to go next. Is there's a part of it, at least for me, where I really feel like when people tell me how much it helps them, so that feeling like I'm being of service, that's such a strong, and what I know, of course, from the world of logotherapy is that we humans are at our best when we are helping or we are serving other people. That's when we're at our best. So to get to serve at your best, at your highest possible place, feels, all of that's just a wonderfully vicious cycle that, keeps feeding itself. So the drug gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So one of the things that you did say in the book that I thought was really interesting, I wanted to go here next for a little bit of time we have left, is, the importance of seeing the positive effects of our work on others. And so when we can actually see oh, that's the end game of our work. This is where it actually landed. That can increase our meaningfulness. So if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. We reference in the book a pretty famous study by just happens to be another Wharton management professor, Adam Grant and colleagues, where they found that even in an otherwise very mundane, very, kind of the lowest level job we can imagine, a job that probably a lot of us all would like to avoid, telemarketing, that in this case, it was college students who are fundraising, but still cold calling alums and asking for money. Again, these are the calls on my phone that I kind of skip. No offense to my my institution, but that when they were fundraising for scholarships and met the scholarship recipients, there was a tangible increase. Because you might say, oh, scholarship recipients, that's inherently meaningful. That's no need to pump that up. But there was a significant boost in both, in basically every metric of success you can imagine: time spent on the phone, number of calls, amount fundraised, amount per person and in aggregate, and all these kinds of things. Based on, and by the way, this was a brief meeting with these beneficiaries. And I think that's the single biggest, actually, Alise, what you just mentioned, single biggest when I go give talks in organizations and the question invariably comes up, how can I make my work seem more meaningful? Like my same job that I have today. That's always my recommendation. Try to find who is that. And sometimes it's an ultimate end beneficiary several steps removed, or sometimes it's based on, again, let's say the purpose of your company, and that you doing your job well helps your company, which in turn advances that purpose. But what is made better because of your work? And I think all too often in our daily office jobs, we can lose sight of that bigger picture. And so just that either interaction with someone whose life was made better or changed or helped by the work I do can really help and can really show, again, like measurable productivity and motivational increases. It's powerful.
No question. So just seeing who it is, looking for who is actually being helped by my work is very, very powerful. And then leaders and organizations can do a lot too by setting up the way that they do their business and their culture to usher in and bring in, like Stryker does, the medical device company. They will very frequently bring in patients who have been either helped by the medical devices that they've been implanted with, or that have saved their lives. And so that all employees can hear how their work, whether they're in accounting, whether they're in marketing, whether they're in R&D, contributed to that person is still standing here. And that's powerful, really powerful.
And I think the reality of the human being that's being helped is part of the power, because I'm listening and thinking about, what did I do wrong when I was a management consultant and I was trying to motivate a team to make their way through long, boring lists of financial disclosures in the interest of saving the world by loaning money to developing countries. And what I did wrong was I didn't bring them to the developing countries where the work was being done. I just told them about it from a windowless conference room. And that is much less powerful than seeing the actual end beneficiaries of one's work.
And even videos of what they were doing in their lives would make a big difference. Okay, so you two, we could talk about all these kind of things for hours, and I do know one of you has to go to a class. This show is listened to by people around the world, and the people that are listening to this podcast probably really care about meaning and how to find more of it, experience more of it. What would you each like to leave them with?
Well, I think I just said it, and I'm trying to think of a better way to say it. So I think it is possible to find more meaning in your work. I mean, certainly if you feel like your work is at a, sort of at a deficit or a decline, it is probably time to take more extreme action, but often just thinking about, what is it in the daily tasks, the variety of things you do that brings you the most joy, you feel it's the most meaningful. And then the other side has the potential to help or make a difference or have meaning to someone else. Try to do more of those things, or try to interact more with the people who either bring you joy or help affirm that meaning. And I think the other is, if you are in a job where you're saying, and this is the outcome of our 9/11 research, I'm in it for the money and I really want to fuel the meaning in my life that takes place outside of the workplace. My job allows me to do that. That's okay. That's still
absolutely
a meaningful life. But then just make sure, am I being paid enough to fuel that, whatever my goals are outside of work? Am I being paid fairly? Am I, there are all these sort of considerations that then go along with that. But in the spirit that calling doesn't need to always just sit in the privileged part of the hierarchy, there can be very meaningful jobs and careers as well.
Beautiful. Christopher, very briefly, just we have to close. But
yeah, I'll second everything that Jen said, but also if you are looking for a job with purpose, there's often a perception that comes at a trade-off with pay. And that might be a false dichotomy. Try to make it a false dichotomy. But if it's not a false dichotomy, if there is a trade-off between purpose and pay, then don't put pressure on yourself to always find both in one position, or you might be disappointed. If you can find them both over the course of your working life, you're a very fortunate person.
It is so wonderful to know both of you, to learn from you, to be inspired by you, to be connected to you. Thank you for coming back on Working in Purpose, and you'll come back again with the next book, yes?
We can't wait.
The next book that originated here. So thank you, Alise, and likewise.
Oh, goodness. I want to hear more about that. Okay, listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about Dr. Christopher Wong Michaelson and Dr. Jennifer Tosti-Kharas, their book and the work that they do. So visit ChristopherWongMichaelson.com. So Christopher, standard spelling. Wong is his middle name, W-O-N-G, and Michaelson, M-I-C-H-A-E-L-S-O-N, ChristopherWongMichaelson.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, we were on air with Dr. Zach Mercurio talking about his latest book, The Power of Mattering, How Leaders Can Create a Culture of Significance. He helped us understand the power of all leaders, assuming that people don't feel seen, heard, or appreciated, and then acting accordingly to assure they do. Sounds very simple, but it's very powerful. Next week, we'll be on the air with Sebastian Page, the author of The Psychology of Leadership, Timeless Principles to Improve Your Management of Individuals, Teams, and Yourself. Promises to be another fascinating and inspiring conversation. See you then. And remember, work is one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave, and can give us the opportunity to do business in a way that betters the world. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.